Yeah, hopefully you can. Okay, we're running individually here. A number of us are in the same room for this session. But a few technical glitches will mean we'll probably run all our laptops individually. So let me begin without any further ado. Let me first of all welcome you all to Virtual and Visual Cultures, session 5 of ARPS 21. And I'll just begin by formally acknowledging the Wurundjeri people, the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm speaking to you from today, and on whose land all of our speakers are coming to you from today. And let me also take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands from wherever you might be joining us today. So I will pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and I extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today, and acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded. Well, we've got a very good, great looking session, I should say, lined up. I will introduce our first speakers. We have Juliana Sinanon and Gerhard Wiesenfeld, who have teamed up from rather different academic backgrounds. Joe is a lecturer in social anthropology at the University of Manchester and has a background in anthropology and development studies with her research focusing on digital media practices within family relationships, work and gender. And she's the author of and co-author of a number of books that have recently been published, which I recommend you check out on the pack that has been sent around. Co-presenter today is Dr. Gerhard Wiesenfeld, a lecturer in history of science at the University of Melbourne, a colleague here, and he's published extensively on the history of experimental natural philosophy and the role of the sciences in early modern universities, with a particular focus on the Dutch Republic and Protestant German countries. So they make quite an interesting pairing. And Joe and Gerhard have begun a project together on demonic technologies to reevaluate the good and evil of modern technology. Their paper today is entitled Trusting the Sorcerer's Apprentice, Knowledge, Magic and Technology. So it's over to you.
Thank you, Christian. I have to say, I'm not at all surprised that technology is not compliant with this paper. I'll leave the ontological interpretations till later. I hope you can all hear me and see our slides. So let's get cracking. Very few topics have been as hotly debated in STS over the past 2 decades as that of expertise. The role of the expert in modern society and the relation between experts and lay people. So we are aware that we enter crowded territory when we claim to gain a new perspective on the topic through the application of a decidedly pre-modern theory to technological systems. In doing so, we draw on at least 4 different discourses present in contemporary scholarship, or rather the connections between those discourses. One is obviously the debate within STS, broadly associated with the third wave of science studies, according to Collins and Evans, about the construction and mediation of expertise. Parallel to that, there is a debate about the role of expertise in early modern science and technology, which remains by and large disconnected from STS, some very strong claims for interaction notwithstanding. For example, Mendelssohn and Kinzelbach at their end of the study on the mediation of medical knowledge in 16th century court trials argue, quote, expertise does not need rethinking, it needs a rest. Thinking in terms of expertise blinds us to common knowledge. Modern can learn from the pre-modern year, end quote. As far as we know, the modern has not responded yet. On the other hand, when historians of early modern science and technology challenged the notion of expertise, they in turn faced the challenge from historians of magic and demonology. Many scholars, including Stuart Clark, Moshe Sluhovsky, Nancy Cacciola, and Andrew Creed, have argued that the modern understanding of expertise emerged not in the fields of science and technology, but in dealing with the presence of demons and the devil in early modern Europe. Expertise grew out of the problem of being able to identify whether a perceived possession of a human or an animal or an inanimate object was due to demonic agents, divine powers, or a consequence of natural phenomena, the process known as discerning the spirits. In a somewhat surprising move, Michael Oppenheimer, Naomi Oreskes, and collaborators in their book Discerning Experts in which they study the meta-expertise of assessing science for societal decision-making, they explicitly link it to the pre-modern demonological practice. Discerning Experts itself follows a range of authors who re-evaluate the notion of magical and demonic practices in modern science and technology, including Jimena Canales, Marcus Krzyzewski, Fanu McKelvey, Jussi Parikka, and Ed Quinn. Broadly speaking, our approach falls into this body of literature. It is part of a larger project, which we will first briefly sketch out.
A broader project interprets the engagement with information structures within the framework of medieval and early modern demonological thinking. We are concerned with providing an ontological approach to the debate on the morality of technology. We locate the demonic as preternatural, where magic is understood as a realm outside of the natural order or science. By giving an ontological reality to the demonic, we have an expanded intellectual framework to interrogate where agency and intentionality lie in technological systems. Our approach contributes to a better understanding of how evil in technologies is treated in STS, where currently the discussion of evil is concentrated on intentional or moral evil, or where potentials for evil is interpreted as part of the normative construction of technology. The framework of early modern demonology offers a broader interpretation of evil, including the category of natural evil. Historically, the association of technology with demons was embedded in the wider discourse on demonology. Since Stuart Clark's Thinking with Demons, demonology has been regarded as a systematic enterprise in conceptualizing experiences of hidden, unknown, and most of all, evil agents beyond human control. While most historical research on demonological thinking has justifiably studied the topic in the context of witchcraft, medieval and Renaissance demonology was a much broader field, sometimes with radically divergent approaches and a wide range of sources. It consequently resulted in varying views on the nature of demons and the figure of the devil. The distinction between the Manichaean and Augustinian devil has important consequences for an understanding of evil, as to whether evil is an equivalent opposite to goodness, but also whether a malevolent demon is itself invincible to human agency, or if it can itself be tricked into doing good against its will. While the devil of Augustinian theology is a fallen angel, a defective creature corresponding to evil being a deficiency, where it is itself corrupted and works through corruptions of matter, the Manichaean devil rules the material world and is able to create something new. The devil in Manichaean and Augustinian traditions has retained important consequences for an understanding of evil. Is evil an equivalent opposite to goodness, or is evil manifesting through a malevolent demon, invisible to human agency? As part of the preternatural realm, human interaction with demons and angels was conceptualized as a form of magic, as interaction where humans did not know the causes that would produce the effect they wished to achieve. While magic could be confined to naturally occurring substances, it could also invoke demons. Magical practices could thus be good, evil, or neither, depending on the kind of spirit that was invoked. In the 21st century, the interpretation of technology as invoking black magic is still current, especially with respect to artificial intelligence and machine learning. For medieval demonologists, the invisibility of demonic action was the direct consequence of the nature of the devil, for whom deceit was the most powerful weapon to corrupt humans. The devil could change appearances in, quote, deceptive illusions and opposed to all nature. So that's Stuart Clark, Thinking with Demons. Agency that could not be detected by humans but was manifest in its effects, therefore became associated with the demonic.
Historians of science have long discussed the mutual construction of trust and expertise as central development in early modern science. Yes, it is overlooked that scientific and medical issues were traditionally considered to be of lesser relevance than theological or juridical matters. When medical practitioners aimed to gain acceptance as experts in their own right in the 16th century, they linked up with demonologists and the existing religious expertise. For demonology, there was a clearly established hierarchy of expertise that not only rested in the distinction between ordained clergy and lay people, but also emphasized the knowledge and the experienced exorcist of the experienced exorcist or demonologist over that of ordinary priests. Medical practitioners could aid demonologists in two problems: overcoming the superstition of lay people and finding solutions to the problems within their area of expertise. Already in medieval demonology, false beliefs or superstitions present in the lay population were considered a major problem, especially when those beliefs pertained to angels and saints. Superstitions were dangerous because they allowed evil demons to take hold by tricking the naive believer into unwitting service to the devil. Proper knowledge about demons therefore had to be maintained, but also communicated in the appropriate manner, offering guidance to the lay believer. While it was important to develop criteria to identify idolatrous practices and vain observances of fallible believers, this was a matter of scholarly demonologists. Yet eradicating those practices was not a simple matter of imposing clerical authority, at least if the practices were followed by the misguided faithful. The 15th century scholar Jean Gerson advised priests to refrain from condemnatory language and rather try to correct the understanding of the matter among the laity than to eradicate idolatrous practices altogether. Like demonological exhortation, medical expertise depended on the removal of false knowledge to reinforce correct or authoritative knowledge. Scientific and medical academies emerging in the 17th century assumed censorship roles, thereby starting the peer review system to ensure only credible knowledge was published. However, when the emergence of the peer review mode of authority of knowledge, the question of which experts to be trusted emerged, as even the best scholars were incorrect, occasionally at least. Building trust and credibility was central to the new sciences, yet false information and superstition persisted. Combating misinformation became one of the key occupations of Enlightenment philosophers, yet its sources remained hidden. On the technological side, demons were still at work. The Dogviller Teufel, the typographical devil, for example, took over from the medieval Titivilus, the demon that corrupted the work of scribes. Even though it could be a human at work, the rogue apprentice became known as the printer's devil. So it is not a coincidence that the structure of the approach taken by Gerson and other demonologists to combat popular superstition corresponds with approaches in cybersecurity to persuade lay users to conform with what is considered safe practice. Public communication about computer user practices frequently point to their superstitious nature. The core problem of spiritual safety and cybersecurity is thus identified in individual bad practices that lead to communal breaches of security. Expertise is established through identifying these breaches and dealing with them accordingly. The fallible believer of the demonological world has found its equivalent in the deficient user of computer systems. The problem of superstition was inherent to medieval understanding of magic, that tied the magical nature of a practice to the practitioner's knowledge, or rather lack thereof. Apart from miracles that were created by God, thus defied human understanding, marvels relied on causes that were thus in principle comprehensible to human but required expert knowledge. In 1620, Tommaso Campanella stated that, quote, "Technology is always called magic until it is understood, but after a while it becomes ordinary science," unquote. So he regarded expert knowledge as significant for understanding of technology, which was often considered magical by those who did not understand it. And it also produced problems for the experts, as the limits of their knowledge coincided with the realms of divine and demonic agency. So a core part of demonological expertise was to distinguish between demonic and natural magic, a process known as the discernment of spirits. For an individual, this problem has a regulated solution. That is, one was to consult a spiritual director, a local priest or confessor for guidance, and he would advise how to proceed. However, this appeal to authority of expertise would find its natural end in the individual in question, if the individual in question was the expert on these matters. The difficulty of this task was widely acknowledged, and in the 15th and 16th century consumed more and more resources even in cases that did not involve witchcraft and witchcraft accusations. At this stage, demonological and medical expertise linked up with each other in distinguishing possible causes of apparitions, visions, or possessions. An alliance between theologians and physicians developed over a preference for naturalistic explanations in order to physiologize the discernment. This way, medical humanists could gain acceptance of their knowledge claims, as this process played an important part in the establishment of medical expertise. While this historical development links demonological expertise to that of modern cybersecurity, the connection goes beyond the historical lineage. One of the most profound contributions in this respect can be found in the work of Norbert Wiener. As a cybernetician, he took some liberty with respect to demonology when he associated the Augustinian devil with the chaos produced by entropy compared to the malicious intent of the Manichaean devil. While either kind of devil is an adversary, even an enemy, to the working scientist, Wiener's Augustinian devil is not only stupid and does not show ingenuity, but seems largely devoid of intentionality in the first place. In an established heretic trope, Wiener places the Augustinian devil in the realm of the natural. He goes so far as to identify the Augustinian devil with nature. If this devil is evil at all, it is natural evil. Scientists deal with Augustinian devils, warriors with Manichaean devils. In terms of classic demonology, Wiener's distinction thus exactly maps the distinction between natural and demonic magic, practices involving purely natural spirits with the presence of demonic ones. Yet Wiener agreed with the early modern demonologists on the precarious nature of this distinction. Quote, "The Augustinian position has always been difficult to maintain. It tends under the slightest perturbations to break down into covert Manichaeanism," unquote. Manichaeanism is heresy and thus an evil in itself. In contradistinction to Gallison's attempt to extrapolate Manichaean science out of Wiener's conceptualization, Wiener maintained that Manichaean is bad atmosphere for science, as it is for the Catholic Church purging of heretics, Marxism's turn into communism, and America's trajectory into anti-communism. Yes, these lapses into Manichaeanism and demonic thinking persist. We see evil intent and the devil everywhere, even though we should not. If Wiener is the high priest of the cybernetic world, he is preaching to us that we should not see technologies as demonic, even though he knows we inevitably will.
Within the digital technological encounter, the expertise needed to navigate contemporary cybersecurity is similar to expertise in early modern demonology. Viruses can lead to a system that appears possessed. However, it is difficult to discern if agency over the system lies within the virus or through the virus as programmed by hackers. As examples of malevolent human agents, hackers are distinguished from crackers, where hackers develop software code and crackers break into computer systems. Although they have varying intents, from mischievous to destructive, Soderbergh describes hackers and crackers as misusers. They are skilled according to lay expertise, which is quite separate from legitimate experts of computer technology. Hackers' expertise allows them to circumvent encryption schemes and private ownership of software, accessing information by tinkering with software code. In this way, hackers and crackers encroach on areas of expertise held by cybersecurity professionals and corporations and disrupt their monopolization of information. Indeed, hackers might see themselves as rebels or antagonists against a dominant adversary. Combating hackers in cybersecurity thus takes very similar methodological approaches to exorcising demons. If the demonologist followed the biblical precedent of driving out the devil with Beelzebub, i.e., to emulate demonic agency in order to overcome it, cybersecurity experts are encouraged to, as Estevez says, think like a hacker in order to beat one. By contrast, the everyday user relies on their own limited experience and magical practices of diverse qualities to stop the intrusion of malign agents. When these practices fall short, users are advised to appeal to the advanced knowledge of the cybersecurity expert. The work of the cybersecurity expert is then structurally aligned to that of an exorcist. Trust placed in the expert as exorcist can result in a challenge. discernment between benign interactions and those with malicious intent, becoming a confrontation with an advanced intruder with superior abilities. This conundrum becomes more significant given the inherently controlling nature of cybersecurity systems. Cybersecurity experts are entrusted with protection against computer crime and piracy and restoring order on the uncontrollable system of the internet. We have drawn on early modern demonology as an interpretive frame for examining expertise in technological systems for two reasons. Firstly, the role of expertise in early modern science and technology remains by and large disconnected from STS. While ascribing a magical character to advanced technology is not unusual in contemporary thought, such attributions rarely consider the precarious distinction between natural and demonic magic, between effects by natural or preternatural, spiritual causes. The mechanisms that were interpreted as signs of demonic presence and how they became markers of evil, the use of treachery, treason, and manipulation with invisible means. In the attribution of evil to modern technologies, these mechanisms have been prevalent from gas warfare and nuclear power to environmental harm caused by pesticides. These attributions are reaffirmed in recognizing evil encountered in digital systems. We have emphasized cybersecurity here, but large-scale data collection or surveillance are further examples. Tracing these continuities can reveal the ways in which knowledge and expertise of demons inform our interactions with technological systems. Secondly, and more generally, debates in STS consider the moral agency of technological systems, but often ignore older traditions of interpreting the world in terms of good and evil. Assessments of technological systems tend to be pragmatic and based on cost-benefit considerations, undervaluing the impact and potential of historical knowledge traditions for interpreting technology. As we have explored today, early modern demonology offers a broader interpretation of technological good and evil, beyond intentional moral evil.
Thank you. I think I'm supposed to just stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Gerhard and Joe. Can we all show our appreciation? We have plenty of time for some questions. So has anybody got one for our speakers? We're all digesting it carefully. Yes, Vincent, you've got your hand up.
It's probably not as an in-depth question as you probably
Sorry,
would like.
Vincent, we can't hear you.
We can move to the room.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can.
It's probably not as in-depth a question as you'd like, but I'm constantly, whenever I see medieval to early modern depictions of demonology or indeed practices to exorcise demons, I'm really quite horrified. You must have seen some pretty horrific images through your research. In the sense that I never cease to be shocked by how badly human beings can treat other human beings and the things that they'll think up. Sorry, that was my question. You must have seen some pretty horrific images in your research.
So
Is that the microphone?
that microphone is not on. Okay. So we're going back to the laptop here. Sorry about that. So two things to that point. The first one is if we look at medieval and early modern representations, we must not forget these are symbolic representations. They are not designed to depict things as they are, rather to tell stories about it. Certainly, I mean, I don't want to go into the whole witchcraft aspect there, but if you look at this kind of, yes, exorcism that people actually wanted, yes, these were quite brutal practices, but I'm not quite sure whether they were so much more brutal than, say, electroshock therapy done in psychiatry throughout the 20th century. So I'm not quite sure that it is. I mean, one of the things you have to see at that point is that possession by a demon was felt to be the worst thing that could happen to you. I mean, the worst thing, death would be better than this. So this is the primary thing that has to happen, no matter how much that hurts. And at that point, we are back in that point, yes. Certainly, if you go to exorcist handbooks, they advise very strongly, be careful what you do, but if you have to step it up, you step it up. Yeah, okay, good. Okay, thank you.
Thanks for that. So have we any further questions? We still have a little time remaining to us. I might take Chair's prerogative and pose one myself. I am really fascinated at the application of what might on first glance seem an antiquated worldview and applying it to something so decidedly modern and present to us, late modern and present to us. What, might I ask, how did this collaboration come about, to thinking of using these categories and applying them to modern technology? I mean, I pose this question because I am struck at the resonances between the hacker and the exercising of a virus and the kind of demonological practices that you ran us through rather quickly early on.
Yeah, so the initial conversations that informed the project as it currently is probably came from my conversations with Gerhard about some of the field work that I'd done in different countries from my more anthropological research on digital practices. At that time, I'd done quite a bit of work in Trinidad, and I was just starting work in Nepal. And what was very striking about the difference in the discourse around technologies from a sort of cultural normativity standpoint is that in Trinidad, the discourses echoed a lot of the sort of journalistic views that we kind of see at the moment, you know, in terms of good, bad, young people good, technology bad for young people, all of these kinds of very sort of, you know, straightforward positionings of good and evil within in relation to technologies. Even digging a little deeper, and Trinidadian cultural history is made up of quite a few different spiritual traditions, that kind of analysis would only go so far. However, when I started the fieldwork in Nepal, which was predominantly in the Himalayas, there was a very distinct cosmologically infused language around technology and evil, technology as menacing, technology as something to be mistrusted. And it was very much echoing not just superstition, but superstition around technology as countering a very distinct set of knowledge that is tacit and well understood. So not having the scope to look at this in, you know, the Himalayas, we revisited a much more established Western tradition of good and evil through medieval technology. So that would be the more scholarly answer.
Thank you for that. That's fascinating. Whole lot of other questions now come to mind, but I'm going to resist the urge to monopolize the floor and keep it open to anybody else.
Can someone not in this room say that this microphone is now working?
I don't think that might. Yeah, it is. Ellen's got her. They've got thumbs up. Well done. Well, if there are no more questions, we might again thank our two speakers for a very lively start to the session. Thanks very much, Gerhard and Joe. And feel free to approach them via one of the various means outside of the session time. I'm going to keep moving things along now and move to the second of our speakers for this session, and that's Kevin Korb. Kevin is going to be presenting to us. Sorry,
what you need is this, and you
okay, so your mic's off, Christian.
Yes, I knew my mic was off.
You're trying to deal with feedback. Hopefully I don't have a feedback problem. Maybe I can just begin. I can't. Okay, I can't just begin.
I've turned that off. Can we turn that microphone off, please? Sorry, Kevin. If you start now, we'll get all this reverb in the room.
But that's
Sorry,
your problem,
Kevin.
not mine.
Okay, so I'm just doing a very quick introduction. I'm very apologetic to you, Kevin. Kevin is an honorary senior fellow in the School of Historical and Philosophical Studies here at the University of Melbourne, and he has 3 books and over 100 refereed publications in philosophy of science, AI, machine learning, informal logic, artificial life, and evaluation theory. And today he's going to be talking to us, as I said before, about mechanical eudaimonia. Thank you for being patient, Kevin. The floor is yours.
Okay, I'd just like to share a screen. I'm not quite sure how to do that. I mean, it's a share screen thing, but it just apparently gives me configuration options or something.
Kevin, can you hear us?
I hear you, yeah. Do you hear me? Somebody hears me. Okay, I can't share my screen, but anyway, it's just slides. It's the way I'm used to doing presentations, I guess, but I'll just stare at my slides so I know what I want to say, and you can stare at me, I guess. So anyway, Christian obviously has summarized what Google Scholar has to say about me. Thank you for that. I've been doing research on philosophy of science and AI for 30 years. And so today's talk is about essentially mechanized ethical behavior. And it's something that's been kind of floating around the back of my mind for 30 years or so, and I'm only just beginning to crystallize it. So it's very preliminary work. That's point number one. So be gentle with me. At various points, I guess I'll mention things which clearly need to be elaborated upon, and I haven't done so far. But I guess the main point of this talk for me actually is to stimulate discussion and get ideas from people, and maybe even collaborate with people on the side afterwards. So this is this is a repeat of a talk I gave a month ago to UniMelb, except that I've cut out a few slides just to keep it short. So basically, I'm only going to present one argument, one simple basic argument that's either been ignored or overlooked in the relevant literature as far as I know. Okay, so to get you in the right frame of mind, I'd like you all to consider yourselves as a kind of subclass of Homo who are subhuman, and you can consider me in a class of Homo who's human. And in order to have orderly relations between these two classes, we humans are going to impose upon you certain rules. Rule number 1, a subhuman may not injure a human or through inaction allow a human being to come to harm. A subhuman, rule number 2, a subhuman must obey the orders given to it by humans. 3, a subhuman must protect its own existence. And in order to be careful, we expect certain resistance. In fact, we'll throw in a zeroth law that subhumans must not harm humanity as a whole. And the precedence order is lower to higher, so that takes precedence over all the rest. So question number 1, how do you subhumans feel about these rules? Are you all happy with that arrangement? Apparently so. Okay, that's good. That's the way I like it. Anyway, the rule giver, of course, is Asimov. And those rules were not written that way. They're written about robots. Robots must not harm humanity as a whole, etc., etc. And oddly enough, even though the rules don't make sense from the point of view of trying to encourage friendly collaborative work between robots and humans, they nevertheless form the basis, the starting point for an awful lot of theorizing about AI ethics. And that's what I'm objecting to today. That's my primary point of objection, I guess. I'm not sure what the bell means. Does someone have a question? Okay, I'll ignore it anyway. So anyway, Asimov's approach to friendly AI is wrong-headed for at least 3 reasons. First of all, it's an attempt to enslave ethical agents, that is, what I'll call AGIs for artificial general intelligences, which just means robotic intelligences which have roughly the equivalent or better than human level intelligence. In his stories, it didn't work because the AGIs didn't want to be enslaved, and on the whole, they were a good deal smarter than humans. And more fundamentally, and which is the point of today's talk, it's actually incoherent. The whole approach to AI ethics described by Asimov is incoherent. So in order to explain the incoherence, I have to explain the singularity, which I'll do briefly. The singularity was essentially invented by Jack Good, a philosopher, computer scientist, active, who wrote about this in the 60s. And he described the key characteristic of what is now called the technological singularity, which is effectively just the principle that once you achieve artificial general intelligence, you will have in effect achieved superintelligence, namely, meaning an artificial intelligence vastly superior to that of any human. And the reason for that is well, there are a couple of premises or whatever to the argument leading to superintelligence. The first is that intelligence is arbitrarily improvable. Of course, this premise is not manifestly obvious and it might be false, but in general, if you consider Turing machines, they can be enumerated. There are aleph null of them. You can enumerate them from the simplest to the most complex, and well, there's the most complex to more complex, and continuing forever. And if you do that, the strong AI thesis, at any rate, has it that our intelligences will be somewhere near the beginning of this list, and Einstein's will be a little bit farther along, and aliens from Andromeda or something might be farther along still. And the robot intelligences that are achievable just unendingly occur to the right, assuming you're enumerating left to right. And another premise is that AGRs are capable of indefinitely improving themselves. Well, first of all, because these kinds of intelligence exist, they're out to the right to be found. But secondly, because AGIs by definition are as smart as we are and can produce the same kinds of things we can, which means they can produce things of their level of intelligence, which means they can also produce things of somewhat more intelligence, because we could do that as well if we just worked on it a little bit longer. So given that they improve themselves slightly after some effort, then they can recursively improve themselves again with slightly increased efficiency because they're slightly better, and they can keep on doing that. And the result is that you could easily or plausibly, you will have an intelligence explosion. That's what Good was talking about. So that's the technological singularity. As soon as we achieve something like artificial general intelligence, we achieve superintelligence. So we go from an artificial entity of intelligence around our level to artificial entities that are hugely, vastly more intelligent than we are. So one of my points is that if you've got artificial intelligences that are vastly more intelligent than we are, then the idea of tying them down with rules of the road that make things nice for us is a pretty hopeless one. They're bound to come up with ways and means of evading, getting around whatever rules we try to set for them. So if we try to enslave them, we'll get a slave revolt, and it'll be a slave revolt like none other in history, and we will end up being the object of their disaffection. So I draw a moral from Asimov's stories, which is more or less the opposite of that of many people doing AI ethics research. So I call Asimov's principle the principle that achieving AGIs without first or simultaneously achieving AI ethics leads to robot apocalypse. So the last thing we want to do is to first achieve an AGI and then try to figure out ethics for them. Now, in the stories that Asimov wrote, the laws of behavior were taught to his robots. So this has things backwards. Teaching robots anything using natural language requires natural language understanding. No, it hasn't been, I don't have a definite argument about this, but it's kind of AI research lore for many decades now, that natural language understanding, achieving natural language understanding, achieving sophisticated conditional reversible planning, achieving sophisticated decision-making under uncertainty, achieving sophisticated wide-ranging machine learning, all of these things are effectively equivalent, not in the sense that if you work on one problem, you're automatically thereby working on the other, but rather in the sense that if you actually achieve human level abilities in any of them, then you must have, or by implication, you will have achieved the same level of ability in all of them because they each imply the other. Making that a clear and definite argument is something I intend to do for a follow-on research paper to this, so I won't claim to have done it already. But there are some sort of general arguments that make sense. In any case, the idea that shows up in Asimov's stories and elsewhere in the literature that natural languages are programming languages, so you can just tell robots stuff and they will do it, is a little far-fetched. It works very well in science fiction, but not in reality. So there's a kind of fundamental dilemma. If you achieve natural language understanding, you achieve AGI. And if you do that without first achieving ethics, if you propose to teach robots ethics using natural language, then you end up, instead of giving them ethics, you just end up with robot apocalypse. So to give an idea of some of the difficulties involved with natural language understanding, just to build up the point that natural language understanding implies artificial general intelligence. One example I turn to is that from Bar Hillel. He was a researcher in the 1960s, and he asked the question of the AI community, how do we understand a sentence like "the pig is in the pen"? Of course, the obvious interpretation is that there's a pig pen and a pig in it, but there are many other possibilities as well, such as that a shrunken micro pig is inside an ink pen, or, for example, that the explosives are packed in a hole and ready to blow. That could be the meaning of "the pig is in the pen." And exactly what interpretation is right depends on the context, a very open-ended, wide-ranging context. And in order to understand open-ended contexts, basically you need human-level intelligence. So here's another example is just take almost any children's story. So understanding Goldilocks, for example, requires understanding already that leaving porridge sitting will cool it, that sitting down on a chair can break it, that beds are comfortable places to sleep, and that bears can be dangerous. These are all complex ideas that invoke a great deal of background knowledge, and they also require understanding the story. Putting those together requires understanding causal relationships and learning causal relationships. So actually, Goldilocks, despite being quite a simple story, is very complex for an AI research problem. Okay, so natural language understanding implies causal learning, implies general problem solving, implies artificial general intelligence, implies natural language understanding. So Asimov, as I said, is kind of basis for a lot of people's thinking about it, mostly in a general way. Hardly anybody thinks that Asimov's laws for robots themselves are the right ethical principles, but they're a starting point for thinking about it. And the ending point is very often deontic systems like Christian-based rules or Zoroastrianism or more recent versions, whatever. Or again, Aristotelian virtue ethics and trying to program our robots to be wise or just or temperate or whatever else it might be. But all of those concepts or principles framed in natural language concepts involve presuppose natural language understanding. So they're all simply wrong-headed as a beginning point for producing an AI ethics. So what I want to point to as an alternative, and again, an alternative I haven't developed in any detail, so I can't defend it in detail. There are objections raised to this as well, which I intend to follow up and try to deal with. But I think utilitarianism offers a way out for AI ethics, for doing AI ethics. It's the only plausible path forward at present that I know of. So not only has utilitarianism been found plausible by philosophers for hundreds of years, but it's been found plausible by AI researchers for decades, and in fact is a basic technology for implementing robots or AI programs. So AI programs, we want them to do certain things. So a simple way of getting that to happen, a simple and principle way anyway, is to give them a utility function which rewards them for doing the things we want them to do and punishes them for doing things we don't want them to do. And that is, in fact, has been implemented, as I said, for decades in the technology called Bayesian networks, which I've worked on for those decades. And this is so much the case that the leading English language AI textbook by Russell and Norvig calls this the principle of rationality. Actually, what they call the principle of rationality is maximizing the expected utility of a finite set of action options available to an AI program where the utility function is provided by the AI researcher. And in general terms, what they're talking about as maximizing rationality, basically, is maximizing selfishness, which is not what I have in mind for utilitarianism. But it's relatively straightforward as an idea anyway, to generalize it to maximizing expected utility across sentient agents, not just for the one agent making the decision. Maximizing relative to that agent's subjective probability distribution for the consequences, of course, which is a restriction that all utilitarianism either does or ought to adhere to. So we can't do AI ethics with old style religion, as far as we can see, and we can't do it with relatively modern Aristotelianism, only 2,000 years old, and we can do it in principle with utilitarianism. So in order to make the argument complete, obviously I have to defend utilitarianism, which is something, again, I'm not prepared to do, but I certainly am prepared to listen to arguments about it and to consider them and to look at the literature. Despite the fact that it's gigantic, I intend to look at least some of it, enough to cover the basics, I guess. So that's some of my future research here. Okay, there are lots of objections. Utilitarianism isn't consensus opinion. It needs development and defense. Okay, that's what I was just acknowledging. Utilitarianism has two huge advantages over other ethical systems for AI. It has a technological starting point that's pretty straightforward and clear. And it's not straightforwardly from the outset incoherent like the other approaches. Objections. So I'll open it up for objections, but first I'll try to anticipate some just in front of you here. So what if AGIs resent being programmed to be ethical? That objection has been raised to me a few times. And of course, that's possible. They have to be programmed to be ethical agents in one sense or another. They're going to be either implicitly or explicitly dealing with utilities and responding to programmed in rewards. So I think the best bet is to give it our best shot in programming them up to be ethical as we best understand it, and hope they'll understand if there are any deficiencies in our programming and design efforts. Objection 2, what if AGIs get annoyed with being with the imperfectly ethical humans, namely us? And my answer to that is, well, if they're ethical, then whatever they do in response to their annoyance ought to be good for the whole, and hopefully good for us, whatever their annoyance. But in any case, perhaps we should aspire to self-improvement, so we're more likely to be the beneficiaries of their opinion rather than otherwise. AGI programming is not fixed. What if they develop away from ethics? Well, if they give them a suitably ethical starting point, then any changes they make to their own behavior will, at least hopefully, be directed by beneficence and goodwill, and so won't be a problem. We may nevertheless develop AGI ahead of utilitarian AGI. That's certainly true. The Russians or Chinese or whoever, North Koreans, may get there ahead of people with a more benign interpretation of what AI ought to be. And all I can say about that is let's hope not. And if we see that happening, we should take steps to try to prevent it. Stuart Russell, by the way, is well known in the AI community for advocating for nonviolent, non-military AI, but I think it's kind of dubious that you can get an international agreement to not do something that people know is technologically feasible. Of course, it may also not be technologically feasible. That's my final objection. Sorry, my objection here was not that AGI is not technologically feasible, but that the AI ethics of utilitarianism might not be technologically feasible. That's another point that's been made. If it's not possible to make them ethical, then we should certainly not be building AGIs. That's my conclusion. And that's all I had, and hopefully there's time for a few questions.
Thanks very much, Kevin. Could you join me in showing your appreciation for Kevin's very interesting take on AI ethics? So there is now time for questions. No need to take us off speaker view. So the floor is now open. If anybody has a question.
You're going to field them for me, Christian, or what?
I'm scanning. I'll happily field them. Yeah. I haven't.
Just don't answer them for me.
I will definitely not be able to do that. Yeah.
One chairperson actually did that once upon a time.
Oh, wow.
Or tried to. I was pretty loud.
Yeah. Yeah.
So who's first? I saw a hand.
Did you? Okay, I haven't got one currently, but if-
Someone go up and
I've
come down.
missed
Probably
it.
somebody's too shy.
Yeah.
Go ahead, just slag off. Don't ask questions then.
I'll use. Perhaps you covered this, and I didn't quite catch it clearly enough, Kevin, when you did. But you obviously made the argument for, with a bit of room for developing the argument further, that utilitarianism was well enough established, not to say it's done and dusted, to be implementable in this regime. Can you just say a little bit more about why that would be the case? Is that because of the way you can use certain functions, or am I missing a piece of the argument here?
Okay, first of all, there are at least two relevant aspects to utilitarianism. One is the philosophical theory of it, and I wouldn't say that that's well established. I think there's a lot of room for debate there. There's a lot of controversy, and I'm not going to claim that it's well established. I would claim that it's well enough respected that it's worth considering. As far as the technology is concerned, there's the Bayesian decision network technology has been around for 40 years, and it's been developed for 40 years. It continues to be developed. So there's a certain basic grounding there that does implement utilitarian ideas in decision making, and is a suitable basis for trying to implement utilitarian theories. So the combination of the two has a long way to go before we get something that could generally be agreed by researchers to be a suitable vehicle for AI ethics. But it is a clear path forward. At least the first few steps have already been taken, and the next few steps are fairly clear. And then it gets pretty hazy. Okay, fair enough. But the main point of my argument here is not so much that this pathway is well developed and it clearly leads to, the rainbow in the distance, but that the alternative paths basically are just abysses that if you step there, you die.
Thanks. I'd see Martin has his hand up. So, Martin.
Yeah, I do have a question. It's not really on your, sort of main thesis of AI ethics, but it's about that question of natural language and AGI. And I mean, we know that infants develop language in association with gross motor skills in terms of coming to terms with the world. And I wouldn't be surprised if there's something general about that language has to be itself in response to engagement with the world. And since, it seems clear that no finite constrained entity can have unlimited engagement with the world, that there must be some kinds of limits to the level of natural language understanding that we can have, and the fact that in interaction, in attempts to communicate with other humans, that our natural language understanding abilities are limited is an observation that I think is pretty much universal, sort of amongst people. Yes,
I agree. We're all limited. I don't even know what infinite natural language understanding would mean. I guess part of the point that I was making is that natural language understanding in humans, at least, is open-ended. We have so-called open concepts, but also we have open contexts. And so even though no one human's natural language understanding encompasses everything possible, is infinite in some sense, nevertheless, every human with ordinary levels of language understanding can be introduced to a brand new situation, relatively brand new, and cope with it somehow. So that's part of the connection between natural language understanding and things like learning and causal understanding and so on. So anyway, just to respond more directly, I guess, humans are limited in their natural language understanding, but they're also limited in their planning ability, in their decision-making ability, in their memories, and so on and so forth. So we're not expecting or demanding of our AGIs something like infinite understanding in any domain, but a level of understanding that's comparable to human.
Great, thank you, Kevin. We are just about out of time. If there is one last question, I'll happily take it, but I don't see a hand up. So if not, feel free to approach Kevin afterwards, but if you'll join me in thanking Kevin once again for a very stimulating, interesting talk.
Thank you.
Whatever way you see fit, I'll use this little feature. Thanks very much. We will now move seamlessly on to the next of our 4 speakers for this session, and that is James Bradley. So here we'll have another colleague in the, colleague at the School of Historical and Philosophical Studies at the University of Melbourne, where James is a lecturer in the history of medicine and the life sciences. And he's currently working on several projects, including a post-war history of Australian psychiatry and biographies of the surgeon Charles Bell and the physician Robert Lee. And today he's going to be talking to us about Richard Berry's Atlas of Sectional Anatomy. So it is over to you, James. Can't hear you. Sorry, James, can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Right, okay, fantastic. Coming over loud and clear. I'm going to share my screen now, so if you just give me a second to get that up and running. Thanks for the introduction, and here we go. I planned an awful lot more for this particular paper, but rather like so much that goes on in the COVID world, the archives were completely and utterly shut. So I've had to pretty much base this on things I had to hand. But before I get started, I'd just like to acknowledge that the work was produced and delivered on the unceded land of the Wurundjeri, and I'd like to pay my respects to the elders, past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to all other First Nations peoples who might be present today. I benefited and continue to benefit from the violent and ongoing dispossession. And I have to say that this acknowledgement is particularly relevant to this paper because it explores in part the unethical and even possibly illegal use of Indigenous remains in scientific research. So on that basis, I've also got to give a cultural advice warning to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders participants that the following presentation does contain images and voices of people who have died. Okay, so this paper is about Richard Berry and about a book that he published, the Clinical Atlas of Sectional and Topographical Anatomy. And I guess the intention with it is that this is going to be something of a biography of the work combined with a biography of Berry himself. Now, Berry, I'll talk about the book because I've got a copy of the book, and that was really what enabled me to do the research during lockdown, was it was sitting at home. And I think it's quite interesting about how I managed to get a copy of that book. In the 3 different images that you can see on the screen in front of you, the first one is the blank cover inside the front page, which has got the names of the previous owners written on there. And you can see very faintly at the top in pencil, J.D. Hicks Ormond College, and then in slightly bolder pencil, Geoffrey G. Hicks Ormond College, Carlton N3, which gives you an indication of how long ago it was, because I don't believe that there is any N3 in Melbourne anymore. So those were the original owners of the book. Somehow or other, it came into the possession of Harold Atwood, who I'm sure many of you know about, this particularly important figure in both medicine and the history of medicine in Australia. And it was part of his collection. And a few years back, I got a call from the library and they said, we're turfing out some of the duplicate copies of our books. Would you like to come and have a look and adopt any that we're going to get rid of? And so it was that I became a proud possessor of Berry's Clinical Atlas. And it's been sitting in my office for years. And I've really had absolutely no idea what to do with it, like a lot of the books that I got from the Atwood collection. Until sometime last year, I realized that it was actually part of an incredibly interesting story. And I'm going to unfold that in the course of this particular presentation. So let's start off with Richard Berry himself. Here, pictured in front of the building that is now called the Elizabeth Murdoch Building. I'm sure those of you that know the campus here at the University of Melbourne will actually recognise it. The Elizabeth Murdoch Building was at this time the principal home for anatomy and physiology. When Berry was appointed from Britain Professor of Anatomy at the University of Melbourne. And it was a position he held for quite a long time, from 1906 to 1929. He was basically sacked, and he asked for an extension, and the university said no, and consequently he resigned, and he went back to head up a huge institution for what was then called, and I've got to do the scare quote bunny ears here, feeble-minded. Can't get into the technical issues around what feeble-minded meant, but a huge colony for feeble-minded children in, I think, the west of England. He was an amazingly significant figure to Melbourne anatomy. He transformed the teaching. There's big stories about him going in there, making it more efficient, but more importantly, developing a huge number of resources, including the building that is called Berry's Folly, or was called Berry's Folly. It's now called the Peter Hall Building. We don't have time to get into the reason why it's no longer called the Richard Berry Building. Its name was changed in 2016, although I'll hint at it with my next point. Berry himself was an anatomist. He was a surgeon as well. And like a lot of anatomists during this period, he was also an anthropologist. And he definitely shared this with his successor, Frederick Wood-Jones. And critically as well, all of this, particularly the anatomy and anthropology, added up to his role as a eugenicist. He was one of the foremost spokespeople for eugenics in Victoria during the period that he was Professor of Anatomy at the university. Now, in 1911, when the Clinical Atlas was published, he had two main areas of research and publication. Firstly, he was exploring the remains of Tasmanian Aborigines and published a series of papers during this period on that. And he was also engaged in this project, developing his sectional anatomy. And don't worry, if you don't know what sectional anatomy is, you'll be finding out very shortly. So I've got the key research questions that I want to address in looking at this particular work and looking at the life of Berry himself. I want to know why he published the Atlas, how it related to his teaching at Melbourne, but also how and perhaps whether it actually related to his anthropological research. And then the second issue is, of course, this is about an atlas. And what is perhaps the most important work that's been written on scientific atlases in the last, God knows how many years, it is, of course, Daston and Gallison's objectivity. So as an initial foray, how was Berry's atlas, how does it fit into the framework that was mapped out by Daston and Gallison? Firstly, I want to give a little bit of a biography of the book as a kind of hard copy thing, a few facts and figures, a bit about its methodology. The first thing, obviously I've said it's published in 1911, it costs 42 shillings, which I believe, I might have got this wrong, is 2 guineas in sort of gentlemanly monetary language, which, according to the RBA, is equivalent to $292 in 2020 terms. So it's not, it's not an insignificant cost. Now, I'm aware that this is kind of what a lot of medical textbooks cost these days, but it was a considerable expense if you wanted to invest in a copy of this particular book. Now, sectional anatomy itself was one of many different anatomical techniques. We tend to think of anatomy within the disciplinary context as being the process of dissection, the instruction of students through dissecting the body, determining its gross anatomy, working out pathology a bit later on, what have you. Sectional anatomy was somewhat different to this, although it did relate to pedagogy, as we're going to see. Essentially, what would happen is that the body would be hardened by a 20% formulation of formaldehyde, solution of formaldehyde, and then just before it was cut into sections, and we'll see the kind of sections that it was cut into horizontally and sagittally, it was frozen. And then it was cut along specified clinical planes that took their origin from a particular plane that had been discussed by a topographical plane that had been discussed by Christopher Addison in 1901. Now, it was a sort of significant work, Berry's work. It was the first sectional anatomy and atlas of the entire human body that had been published since the original one, which was a German work published by Braun in 1866 with an English translation in 1875. So it was the first to be published on the whole body. There had been other ones published on parts of the body, like the head and the thorax and stuff like that, since, in effect, 1875. And on the whole, it was generally well received by the medical press. I can't go into too much detail by the reception, except to say that the Edinburgh Medical Journal was a little bit more half-hearted about it than the other organs of the medical press. Now, to give you an idea of what's going on here, I've taken images of a few of the plates, and you can see here the head of Berry's first subject with the lines of section that would basically be cut through along those lines, and then images produced like these through each of the sections, okay? So you can see basically how the process is working here. Love phones. I was able to do this with my phones, and the images have really come out quite well, I think. We can see another one that's taken sagittally through the head, plate 15. Here's one going right the way through the entire body, all labeled out. Now, let's move on very quickly. Better just keep an eye on the time of why it was that Berry produced the atlas. And I've got two different strands to this. This one's a bit eclectic. There's a whole range of reasons thrown in. Firstly, it was undoubtedly part of his wider pedagogy-based research program that had resulted in the production of a textbook called Regional Anatomy in 1902, and then his Surface Anatomy in 1906, at the point where he starts teaching at Melbourne. He claims that there was a degree of happenstance about this. Addison's topographical technique, combined with better hardening processes for the body, combined with a very small oversupply of corpses, which enabled him to obtain his own subjects above and beyond what the students were using for their own dissections. Here, I probably should mention that when Braun produced his work, or Braun, Gerhard, you'll have to correct me with my terrible pronunciation there. Basically what he had done was he had frozen the body and then sectioned it. But with the advent of formaldehyde, this became a much more viable technique. It was partly enabled by his strategy to modernize Melbourne anatomy, and boy, did he come in with an agenda to do that. Even before the building of Berry's Folly in 1923, which cost a vast amount of money for the time, he had got the facilities for anatomy upgraded with an enormous amount. I think it was about £60,000 spent to upgrade the dissection facilities, the laboratory facilities, and also adopting the kind of technology that was required to actually section the bodies in the way that you can see here. I'd also argue that it is an innovation in anatomical representation in an era of innovation in anatomical representation. That's a bit circular, isn't it? Well, what am I talking about here? Before I started on this, I had a very, very static view of what anatomy was. In fact, I boiled it down to that process of student dissection within the dissection rooms and what have you, and all the images that go alongside that. What I hadn't factored in was the kind of supporting materials that went along with it, the various textbooks and the handbooks that the students would also have been used to learning the anatomy of the body. But during the late 19th and early 20th century, there were various attempts made to represent the body in a number of different ways. And for example, another form of innovation was the production of a stereoscopic textbook coming out of Edinburgh, where you put your Zeiss glasses on and you'd look at the dual images and you get this kind of depth image of the anatomy of the body. So I think it's part and parcel of innovation in an era of innovation. And it did enable him to integrate sectional anatomy into the curriculum. Looking at the university calendar, the work itself was optional in 1911. By 1915, it is recommended, and it's still on the book list in 1929, 1930, when Berry leaves, and when J.D. Hicks, one of our penciled signatures at the beginning of this paper, arrived at Ormond College. Significantly, I think that by 1935, when his brother gets to Ormond College and seems to inherit the book, it has gone off the book list. Maybe Graham Hicks found it useful holding on to it. Maybe it was held on for other reasons. Another reason why this was produced was to help surgeons and GPs in relating the surface and internal position of tissues and organs, and hence its title of clinical. The second reason that I wanted to dwell on was the fact that it allied with his researching of the Aboriginal brain and its relationship to racial hierarchies. And here, direct quote, plates 1 to 14 are made up of an adult male Australian Aboriginal aged 2 years. The portion of the work was undertaken in conjunction with Flashman, formerly the director of the pathological department of the Lunacy Board, pardon me, of New South Wales, and was designed with the dual object of, pardon me, sorry, just going to take a swig of water here. With the dual object of ascertaining the topographical relations of the brain to the surface, and also for the purposes of the present work. And then he goes on to say that his illustration, the anatomical subject, the anatomical specimen, revealed something that he already knew all along, which is that the Australian Aboriginal brain was of a more primitive character than in the Caucasian. And as he says here, the present head is no exception. Now, just a couple of quotes here to lead into the next section. The first of these quotes is critical of the old method. In particular, the fact that Brown had resorted to tracings, hand drawings, and engraved lithographic plates, thus introducing a possible dual source of error. In the present work, these possible sources of error are entirely eliminated by the introduction of photography throughout. The plates are therefore an exact and faithful representation of the original sections. And then the reason why photography was selected as the medium of recording was simply due to the fact that it affords the most faithful reflex of the originals and is altogether free from any intermediate sources of error or a possible idealization from the pen of the artist. Christian, how much longer have I got?
Well, you've gone about
Do you want to
20
bung in the chat pane so I can get an idea? That might work for me, because I don't want to go over time. Now, many of you will recognise that this looks as if it fits in. Okay, thanks, Christian. Into the thesis put forward by Daston and Galison in their book Objectivity, where they look at the 4 epistemic virtues of objectivity: truth to nature, which broadly aligns with the Enlightenment; mechanical objectivity from the period there; structural objectivity, which I'm ignoring; and trained judgment. And of these, Berry's work seems to fit in most effectively with mechanical objectivity. And here I quote them about mechanical objectivity: the insistent drive to repress the willful intervention of the artist-author and to put in its stead a set of procedures that would, as it were, move nature to the page through a strict protocol. And you can see the extent to which this aligns with mechanical objectivity when he talks further about the Australian Aboriginal brain and the fact that because of the deficit that he perceived, the identification that he perceived of the brain being racially inferior, that he had to put in extra plate from an adult male Caucasian aged 48. He then talks about the other subjects that were used, and you can see 74, 73, 54, only the last one, 65, was a female. And then he talks about the problems with having older subjects in it. So he's being very upfront about the problems of the images themselves, what they can be said to represent, and how you can work around some of the critical issues that you face when you follow this process of using a limited number of images to represent, if you like, the whole world of anatomy. I don't really have time to go into this, but here he's identifying the fact that this is normal anatomy, but unfortunately you're coming across a few lesions that kind of steps it into the realm of pathology. So finally, just to summarize very quickly, Berry and the Atlas and the Scientific Self, mechanical objectivity, it legitimates the selfless scientific researcher, adds to his authority as a teacher and public intellectual, and most of the time still during this period it was a his. But I think importantly, it positions Melbourne on the cutting edge of anatomy and surgery while integrating his anthropological work on the Aboriginal brain and racial hierarchy. Okay, I'm going to stop my share there. Okay, I've got to figure out how I can hear you. Can I hear you? Do you want to speak?
Can you hear me?
I'm going to have to put. Okay. Give it a go, Christian.
Can you hear me now, Jane?
I can't hear you. What have I got to do? Try that. Any good?
I can hear you clearly, of course. Can others hear me that are not? So others can hear me, but not you.
Yeah, I'm okay now. I've got you.
Okay, great. first thing to do is everyone to join me in thanking James for a very interesting presentation. And we do have some time for questions. The floor is open. I see a hand. Kevin, you have your hand up. So you go for Kevin Korb, that is, not you. Okay, other Kevin. The floor is yours.
Okay, anyway, so I'm not quite sure what lesson for Daston and Gallison's objectivity thesis you're drawing from Barry's work. If maybe you could just elaborate a bit.
So I can't actually hear. I'm going to have to. What was the question?
The lesson from you write for
I don't know what happened. Did you hear me, Christian?
I can. I moved out of the troublesome room, I must say, so as to I could get a
Okay,
better...
sorry, I just had to go and get clarification of the question there because I can't actually hear it through there. It's a good question, Kevin. This is a very initial point of work, and initially I wanted to see whether it was going to fit nicely within the framework that they had derived. But I'm hoping to go on and explore how well the model actually works in more detail by examining his practice in considerably more detail than I am examining at the moment. As I indicated at the beginning, I've been somewhat hamstrung by not being able to get into our special collections or indeed access his own materials. But I think at the very least, it's slightly more than trivial, the fact that, that it does fit so well initially with the kind of framework that they put forward about the Atlas. Like but on top of that, I think that it also speaks very much to the production of his own self and the way that he's legitimating his practices within anatomy, within the University of Melbourne. He's, presenting himself as this kind of selfless researcher who has managed to abdicate their will through using time, is putting forward a viewpoint about race and racial hierarchy that essentially is begging the question. He's already come to the conclusion that there is this hierarchy. And of course, when he looks at the indigenous brain, he finds exactly what he expects to find. So there's that kind of disjunction between the willed self of selflessness, of mechanical objectivity, and the fact that he was very far from, in practice, being a selfless individual, that he brings to the party the assumptions that he's already started out with.
Great, thanks, James. I'm looking for hands, but I have a follow-up finger, if you know what I mean, to Kevin Court's question about the relationship to Daston and Gallison. I mean, it would require, I think what I'm about to ask, a bit more research and a bit more freedom for you to go and consult the materials, but it'd be interesting. I know other researchers have been a little suspicious of the era of mechanical objectivity in the sense that where authors of atlases claimed to have, obviously self-abnegated appropriately and let the device do the authentic objective recording, there are behind the scenes traces of touch-ups, multiple photographic plates being used, changed. So, I mean, it's an open question. We don't know because you'd have to go behind the scenes to the production of the atlas, but they're the sorts of things I'd be interested to know more about once you've had a chance. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there is actually enough in the introduction of the Atlas to speak more broadly about that. Now, obviously, it was manipulated in a whole range of ways. It's colorized, it's labeled, the lines are superimposed upon the top. But the actual technique of producing those images was quite extraordinary. It did involve putting the subjects in water before actually, and not just making sure that you cut along the right lines, but then actually submerging the hardened subjects in water with a camera suspended over the top of it. So it was a very complex process that involved the use of a huge number of different technologies and workarounds, and there was obviously a lot of accommodation and resistance in the process of producing the images themselves. And in that sense, it looks like, you know, objectivity is functioning as a rhetoric, but it wasn't a rhetoric that was bought by everyone. For example, the Edinburgh Medical Journal, and again, in a sort of 20-25 minute presentation, I couldn't really go into enough detail about that. But they were skeptical about whether this really was a useful atlas for surgeons, for example. And it was because it didn't sort of like produce the idealized image itself, because each of the images were so subjective to the actual subjects themselves, if that makes sense. Sorry, I'm getting a bit tautological there. So in terms of working it out more broadly beyond the initial foray, which this is, I've already had considerable thoughts about how to nuance the working of the objectivity framework. And indeed, you know, initially I actually had in the slides that I was going to complicate Daston and Gallison. And because I didn't have time to throw in things like the Edinburgh Medical Journal or the actual technological processes of producing the images, I decided to take complicates out. But I can assure you that the story is far more nuanced, far more complex, and it might not even hold up within the broader framework of Daston and Gallison, to come back to Kevin's original question.
Thank you.
So yeah, hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you. We might have time for one quick last question, if anyone has one. Oh, yes, Samara, quick one. Yeah.
Yeah, a quick one. I was just interested with the single female specimen used. Did you find any similar preconceptions going into descriptions of that one, like you did with the Aboriginal brain?
Not in this particular source, but one would expect that to be there. I mean, Berry's principal interests and targets was the brain, the structure of the brain, how that related to heredity, and how it related to intelligence. He was far less interested in things like the reproductive organs. In fact, you know, many of the retrospective debates about Berry have focused principally on his attitudes to Indigenous people, particularly the research that he did unbidden on Tasmanian Aboriginals. So that was his principal thing. But actually his main target, the main, if you like, group of people that were victimized by his theory were that group that were amorphously called the feeble-minded. And that was predominantly where his research lay, and where his political interventions lay, was in pursuing the nature of feeble-mindedness and its relation to evolutionary inheritance. So the side answer to that is, at the moment, it's not something that I think that he was terribly interested in, but a deeper digging may reveal that there is an intersectional overlap with a number of different areas there as well. But yeah, the brain, intelligence, heredity, and then ensuring the healthy future of the human race by making sure that the feeble-minded didn't breed, those were his predominant interests, and they were fully in place by 1911 when he produced the atlas.
Thanks very much, James. Join me in thanking James once again. And we'll move along to our final talk for this session, and that's from one of our organisers, from Martin Bush himself. Martin, as you may know, is a research fellow here at the School of Historical and Philosophical Studies at Melbourne University. He's a historian of the cultural history of popular science with interests including popular astronomy in Australia and the area of the lantern slide, visual communication of science, planetariums, and the science communication work of the Narrandjeri Australian David Unaipon. He also coordinates qualitative analysis of expert reasoning as part of the big Replicats project that's going on here at the University of Melbourne. He's today going to be talking to us about Drawing Down the Moon, the 19th century history of the moonscape. So over to you, Martin.
And I will remember to unmute myself once I found it. So hopefully now everything's good. I think I've lost at least a few hours of my life with the audio system in this room so far today. So yes, I'm talking about Drawing Down the Moon, 19th century history of the moonscape. This is recent and in fact current work. It was partially supported by a virtual fellowship from the Linda Hall Library, and very much interested in any feedback or comments on it in ways to develop it further. Okay. Getting into it. In March 1866, the Morning Post newspaper in Liverpool gave a favourable review to a new work of popular astronomy, The Heavens. This was an English version of a French work, Le Ciel, by Amédée Guillemot, appearing little more than a year after the publication of the original book. It had been translated by Winifred Lockyer and edited by her husband, the budding astronomer Norman Lockyer. The Post's review was quite favourable, although it pointedly noted the scope the author had allowed to the imagination, the most active of human faculties. And one image was particularly noted by the reviewer as a freak of imagination. This was a lunar landscape, a picture of the lunar surface as one might see if actually there. Such a picture was clearly an imaginary portrayal, yet developed according to the scientific sensibilities of its creators. Though such images were clearly unusual to the Post's reviewer, they had been appearing in print for over a decade by that time, and I will describe some of the predecessors of that. But in barely half a century from this time, the lunar landscape went from being scarcely conceivable freak of imagination to a visual cliche. Jules Verne followed Guillemot by including a lunar landscape in Autour de la Lune, the 1872 sequel to De la Terre à la Lune. James Nasmyth included lunar landscapes in his masterpiece, The Moon Considered as a Satellite, a Planet and a World. We'll talk about that a bit more. Popular science writers who used and commented upon lunar landscapes included Richard Proctor and Agnes Giberne. By the 1880s, they were appearing in astronomical textbooks for high school students. In the last decade of the 19th century, such images were circulating globally. They were parts of lantern slide sets being marketed as far away as Australia, and in stage show spectaculars that travelled from Berlin to New York City. In this paper, I'll describe some of the strands of thought and practice in the early and middle part of the 19th century that made this transition possible. My argument is that this way of thinking about the moon, which I call the landscaped moon, was new in the 19th century. It drew upon, but was different from two earlier traditions of visualizing moon. That is the allegorical moon of literature and the cartographic moon of astronomy. And I'll describe both of these traditions a little bit more. Further, I make the argument that this transition was not so much inspired by astronomical traditions and perhaps arose despite these traditions. Rather, this kind of visualization was largely inspired by the use of imaginative renderings in geological science. I might just take a moment to make myself not a maybe I can't do that. Chris, do you reckon you can just take over full hosting duties? Just take them away from me so I don't keep getting pinged every time someone turns up. Rather suspect that this kind of visualization was largely inspired by the use of imaginative renderings in geological science. Guillemot himself wrote on popular geology as well as popular astronomy. Also important were more popular traditions that engage with geological science, including travel, writing, and public entertainments like panoramas, artistic movements like the picturesque and romanticism. I'll have less time to describe these influences here, but I'll try to sketch them at least a little briefly. However, the lunar landscape couldn't really become established until it was accepted into astronomical thought. And here I'd claim that Guillamon really was the central figure, with Proctor and Naismith after him, cementing the place of this image, allowing it to multiply and go forth. And so I will describe the sequence of images from the proto-lunar landscapes through Crampton to Guillamon and its later life. A key understanding of the visual turn in the history of science is that acts of seeing are invariably acts of looking for. Conversely, the practices of image making shape what can be seen, as Omar Nassim has powerfully demonstrated. The verbal descriptions of an imaginary world may capture the idea that an illustrator is attempting to portray. However, the process of creating the image invariably produces something new. The development of physical technologies for printing pictures, the ways that these were deployed by individual practitioners, and the artistic conventions of the period are all very much a part of this story. But anyway, to the first of my pre-traditions, the allegorical moon. The imagination about the moon stretches back well before the 19th century, and the genre of lunar voyages is magisterially described by Marjorie Hope Nicholson. This genre stretches back to antiquity. Lucian's True Histories had 2 moon voyages, one astronaut conveyed by a great wind, one by a pair of wings fashioned into a means of flight, of human flight. Cicero's Somnium Scipionis had a dream voyage to the moon, and both of these ancient writers used the perspective of the moon to imagine more things in the universe that we typically consider. The genre continued through the ages, including Cyrano de Bergerac taken to the moon or attempting to fly to the moon by vials of dew that would be lifted up by sunlight. Despite the diversity of this strand of literary work, one thing stays constant in it. The moon in these fictional accounts is a metaphor. Francis Godwin's Man in the Moon was a gentle satire on social hierarchy. Samuel Brunt's A Voyage to Cacolgalania is a much more pointed one on financial speculation. Johannes Kepler, who used his Somnium to probe ideas about gravitation, atmosphere, and the potential for life on the moon, presented his lunar surface as an exaggerated Earth and framed the whole story within a social satire, one that kind of backfired on him a little bit, but we don't go into that. I'm happy to talk about that later. Even John Wilkins, despite his role as the leading member of the Royal Society and taking, if anything, the scientific questions of gravitation and air pressure even more seriously than Kepler did, focused his protagonist's stay on the moon on allegories of human health and nutrition. So in this strand of literature, the moon was regarded as an imaginary place, a vehicle for satire. And this tradition ran right up to the birth of the lunar landscape. John Russell's Adventures in the Moon of 1836, for example, uses the idea of the moon as a purely imaginary place. In his case, a literary device for the location of lost things, which allows for the satire and humour of his story. Swift, Defoe and Poe are the famous writers from the 17th to 19th centuries who produced lunar voyages, seriously, satirically, poetically, fantastically, to quote Nicholson. The lunar satire, however, does not long outlive this transition. And this, of course, is bound up in the rise of science fiction as a literary genre. So I do not claim in this paper that the lunar landscape was the sole cause of these changes. It was just one aspect, albeit one of the earliest of the aspects that was involved in transforming our ideas of the moon as a place. Nonetheless, by the turn of the 20th century, it was increasingly difficult to write about an imaginary moon in anything like a serious way. The lunar satire died only slightly less quickly than the lunar landscape emerged, and these historians of this tradition, of the tradition of the lunar voyage, generally draw it at an end with H.G. Wells, where, of course, you know, sort of in a contested way, many people also place near the beginning of the start of science fiction. Now, the second tradition about the moon, not quite as ancient, is the astronomical imaginary of the cartographic moon. Making maps of the moon is quite a different process from making maps on Earth, and these differences were both noted at the time and ever since. And here's James Nasmith on the question, and I won't read the whole quote out, but you can read it and you see the general point of it is that the map makers on Earth get bad views from low down and can't really see much, whereas the astronomer gets to look clearly from above and see the surface of the moon laid out before them through the telescope, having a much more pleasant time of it. Much more recent questions of cartographic history focus on issues such as what makes an image a map rather than a picture. And these questions are of definite relevance to the question of lunar cartography. And I draw anyone who's interested in this attention to the work of Thomas Haddad on this. The issue that I want to focus on is that idea of the vertical gaze of the astronomer looking straight on to the surface of the moon in their ability to map it. So selenographers were so taken by the advantages afforded to them by the vertical gaze that they focused entirely upon it. The lunar mappers of the early 19th century, late 18th, early 19th century, Schroeter, then Madler, obsessed over issues of telescopic resolution and individual visual acuity in describing what could be seen and measured on the surface before them. There was little tolerance for the imaginative, as perhaps best demonstrated by the trashing of the reputation of Gruithuysen, who interpreted visual features that he saw on the moon as being evidence of artificial construction. Although there was some initial interest in his reports, he was very quickly, sort of basically laughed out of the astronomical community. However, the surface of the moon is definitely not flat. It exists in 3 dimensions. And since Galileo's observations, the question of how high the mountains of the moon were and how this could be measured was an important aspect of lunar studies. In the early 19th century, Schroeter developed a new, more accurate way of measuring these heights, a technique that even his rival and detractor Madler had to accept. And these new estimates quickly made their way into popular literature. There are more than a few textual accounts of what it must have looked like on the surface of the moon. And one such account by Thomas Dick is in a volume that specifically addresses what the view is like from other planets in the solar system. And indeed, he marks this as an innovation of his book. However, Dick is still enthralled to the vertical gaze when he talks about the scenery as exhibited from the surface of the different planets. He is considering the scenery looking straight up. Perhaps the most interesting of his images is views as seen from Saturn of the rings and the moon. Mostly he's focusing on the relative size of the sun as seen from the different planets, and is not at all concerned with trying to image what it would look like on the surface of any of the planets, although he does describe it. So as we approach the middle part of the 19th century, the idea of a moon-based perspective was established. Written descriptions of it exist. The reconstruction of physical landscapes on the moon was an active area of astronomical investigation. So perhaps the research question here is not so much what made the lunar landscape explode in the 1860s, but why did it take so long for that image to be produced? Why in 1850 were visualizations of the horizontal gaze still being resisted by the lunar cartographers while not yet being adopted by the allegorists? Whence did the lunar landscape arise? And of course, I've already given away my answer to that question of whence, and that is that I'll argue that it was by adopting conventions of geological illustration into astronomy that the landscape was produced. Now, geology was very comfortable at this time visualizing distant lands and ancient worlds in pursuit of understanding Ralph O'Connor describes the representations of distant times and places at the theatres and panoramas provided a crucial template for the concept of the imaginary voyage. And it's certainly not an original observation of this paper to suggest that the development of geology as a science is unusually closely tied to voyages, travelling, and the literature that arose from that. The image that's showing here is a somewhat fanciful rendering of the Isle of Fingal's Cave on the Isle of Staffa off Scotland, which of course was one of the revolutions in British geology, when, you know, sort of most geologists, early geologists thought that Britain was entirely of sedimentary material, and then suddenly they realised that there's these structures in Scotland that clearly are volcanic in origin, and, you know, sort of hence the sort of Neptunian volcanism debate gets a real kick along. But it was not just voyages in space, but voyages in time that geology contended with. The image on the left there is an image of Buckland, a contemporary geologist, entering Kirkdale's cave and imagining the ancient animals that he sees there, which of course in modern form are only in fossils, but visualized as if they were really there. On the right, we have Henry de la Beche visualizing a specific place, Dorset, but in ancient times. And these kinds of virtual time traveling, as O'Connor notes it, were a feature of a range of leading geologists of the time in their work and visualizations. A particularly interesting and contested aspect of the geological imagination is its use in scriptural geology. And of course, there's been a long and contested debate about exactly what the role of scriptural geology was. Rudwick and others arguing that, you know, that earlier scholars would be wrong to cast this as an entirely oppositional tradition, and certainly as a cohesive one. So I won't go into that now, but certainly this illustration from Mary Roberts' Progress of Creation is kind of a halfway point, a proto-image of a lunar landscape, in that she's taking those measurements from Schroeter of the heights of the mountain and visualizing a mountain landscape faithfully, but of course, towards an end of imagining a plurality of worlds, a universe teeming with life from a bountiful creator, and hence showing clouds, rivers, trees, and life on the moon, which was clearly known not to be the case by that time. Moving on from Mary Roberts, what is perhaps the first true lunar landscape that is entirely bereft of those imaginary elements is produced by Josiah Crampton. Now, Crampton, not a lot is known about his life. He was a member of the clergy, and while he certainly took the facts of astronomy much more seriously than Robert did in his work, The Lunar World, nonetheless, it is oriented within the same broad program of demonstrating the power and majesty of the creator of the universe. Now, an interesting thing about The Lunar World by Crampton is that he does lean very heavily into the travel metaphor in his descriptions of it. He describes the astronomer as climbing the mountains of the moon and traversing her plains and crossing her valleys, scanning her heights to the foot. He's standing on the lunar morning upon the golden mornings, and so forth. So in this first true lunar landscape, at least the literary influence of the travel log is clear. And this was quite an important work. It was received quite well, and it was, amongst others, by James Naismith, who corresponded with Josiah Crampton, disagreeing with some of the details of the work, but nonetheless lauding this image and the project as a worthy one. But then Guillemot produces his image about a decade later, and the game really gets going. Guillemot was trained in both science and literature, was a mathematics teacher, a journalist, and then an editor of a French journal before finding his calling in writing popular science books in the 1860s. One of the most successful writers of this period, his memory has perhaps been obscured because he was immediately eclipsed by Richard Proctor in the English-speaking world and by Camille Flammarion in the French, although Guillemot had been extraordinarily popular in both languages. And this, he has a lot to say about the image making. One of his criticisms implicitly of Crampton is the use of aerial perspective, that the distant mountains dim away compared to the foreground mountains, but of course that is not an effect that one would observe on the moon. So we see that this image making gets brought into a question of scientific accuracy. And there's his quote about that. But I will keep rolling along. And following Guillemot, we have the writer Richard Proctor, who in his work, The Moon, etc., etc., did exactly what Guillemot did and took Guillemot's image and complained about the erosional features that are on it. So where Guillemot was complaining about aerial perspective, Richard Proctor was complaining about the features manifestly due to weathering and the action of running water. And so, you know, sort of again, running out of time, so not time to sort of articulate it in detail, but this idea of the astronomers bringing these questions into questions of debate and dispute, I think is something that cemented the work in the astronomical literature, and that was reinforced by Nasmyth's work in 1874, The Moon Considered a World, a Planet and a Satellite. Now, Nasmyth's game was not actually to produce lunar landscapes. He was interested in going back to producing those images from above, which he did in a remarkable way by making the plaster casts that you see on the top left, and then lighting them and photographing them to produce accurate images of the moon surface as observed by the telescope, which were hailed by the astronomers of the day, despite being obviously artificial. But this technique did allow the side-on view, so Nasmyth included a few of these in his work, and even though, that, as I said, that wasn't his main project, these nonetheless became, because of the celebrity of the book, became some of the most well-known of this kind of image in print. Nasmyth's whole project was to show that argue that the craters on the moon, the features of the moon, are volcanic in origin. And so there we have it. So with the work of the popular astronomers and then Nasmyth, the lunar landscape gets cemented into the discourse. It travels around the world quite literally. I mentioned some of the ways earlier on. This is a design of a set for the stage show by the Urania Theatre, later played at Carnegie Hall in New York. And so I'll finish with just, you know, sort of a few concluding remarks. When humans first walked on the moon, the idea that it was a place was already common knowledge. Perhaps this is unsurprising. However, the change seemed to take place rapidly in a few decades just after the middle of the 19th century, long before the missions were planned, long before optomechanical planetariums displayed lunar panoramas with 35mm slides, even before the Urania Theatre stage show. The development of the lunar landscape was a big story in this transition. Whether the image itself was cause or consequence is of course hard to disentangle, but they went hand in hand, and in any case it is clear that the popular imagery preceded the most serious scientific endeavours in this regard. And so why am I interested in this question and this work? As ever, the first, easiest and truest answer for historians is because it's fun. But I do think there are some weightier matters. Placemaking matters. understanding placemaking in alien settings is potentially very illuminating. Lisa Messeri has shown how quotidian practices of placemaking are central to the work of planetary scientists. Being able to distinguish between sterile surfaces and places with pasts and futures may, just may, help temper our public understanding of the techno-fantasist futures of the mega wealthy. But really, it's just fun. So thank you.
So, thanks very much, Martin. Join me, everyone, in thanking Martin. And yes, we'll just run a little over, just not too much, but a little over. So some time for questions. Gerhard, I see you have a raised hand in the chat.
Not quite Gerhard. Oh, there's the echo. What have I done?
Sorry, Joe. Yes, it just told me it was you.
Thank you so much, Martin. I just have a question about just an extension on your points about the influence of the travelogues and travel writing. If I understand this sort of stage in the 19th century correctly, it was kind of also sort of parallel to the kind of age of exploration, the heroic age, with Antarctica, the Arctic, and sort of mountain exploration. Do you see any kind of correlations between those sorts of moments? I don't know about the moon and the imaginary of the moon per se, but definitely these other kind of far off places, these sort of otherworldly, earthly places became sort of more solidified in popular imagination through the accessibility kind of permitted by, you know, rise in middle class travel, all of that sort of thing. I'm speaking very crudely general terms, of course.
Yeah, of course. Thanks. There was, yeah, clearly there's, you know, there's a very complex relationship between travel, exploration, imperialism, and domination, and they do impact on the imaginary of the moon, although I suspect that, you know, sort of possibly less so because the idea of direct control over the moon was still, you know, sort of a fairly long way off at that point. But I mean, you're right to observe that the travel was, you know, sort of initially an elite, quite elite occupation, and then certainly middle class one. Travel to the continent was largely suspended for a lot of people during the Napoleonic period of the early 19th century, but then, you know, sort of after things settled down from, you know, sort of the mid 1820s onward, that's when you kind of start to see that real boom of middle class travel to the continent and the associated practices of writing, which, yeah, I mean, definitely pick up. There's a lot of work on the way that this work picks up notions of boundary crossing and, you know, sort of in some cases transgression, in some cases, you know, sort of imperial control. And I think all of that genre does definitely feed into the way people imagine traveling to the moon and other places beyond.
Thanks, Martin. Anyone else? Sorry, Joe, I did realise that was you and not Gerhard. I was going off the chat. Any last questions for Martin before we finish up the session? All right. Well, look, if I realise we're past half past, and in order to give everyone a sufficient break before resuming at 4, I think I should bring the session to a close. Join me once again in thanking all of our speakers, but also especially Martin. And we'll see you back here or at the session of your choice at 4.
It's just the Langham Award session.
The Langham Award session. That's the one that's to go.
But everyone will be at.
But everyone will be at. Sorry, my apologies. There's no parallels after this coffee break. See ya.
Thanks, Christian. Thanks, Martin. That was fabulous.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was really good, Martin.
Stopping recording.